Come on, Socks. Come and sit with me. Oh, we're both sleepy, I know. Dreadful sleepless night here. There's Socks. There's been a gap of a few days since my last video about going to the Gorton Monastery book sale. Oh, we've just got on with things quietly here, haven't we, Socks? Touch of insomnia. And I've spent my days drawing for a couple of different projects. There's a new art fair on in October, and I need to do some work for that. And I've started, and also this ongoing project, which I can't talk about yet, I keep saying. And some reading time as well. This week was meant to be all about reading. It's turned into artwork and insomnia and migraine. I keep working on my iPad and concentrating too long on too small a kind of page, and it gives me terrible headaches, which is silly. Anyway, I have read a bit, even though this week was meant to be all about reading. I got frustrated with so much I was reading, like this month's book club book, which I don't like at all, and I've chucked. But I think in these videos, it's best when I don't talk about the books that I've dumped unfinished. And it's best when I don't talk about the books I intend to read. It's best when I talk about the books I have read. And so what this week became, or is becoming, is kind of reading what I feel like reading, really. I leave everything lying around handily. Everything's in piles on the floor or on the shelves, ready in different vaguely jumbled categories, so I can get anything I need from whichever genre. So this week I'll give you a couple of highlights. I read this for the first time. I'd read excerpts from this before in anthologies, and never read it. I wish I'd read it as a kid. This is the mid-70s. It's The Third Class Genie by Robert Leeson. Now, Robert Leeson was a kids author who was very political, actually. Looking up some stuff about him, he was an avowed Marxist. It's very political, very committed. He wrote novelizations based on Grange Hill off the TV, and that was how I knew his work. And his conjuring of that comprehensive and all the kids was kind of more accurate than the TV show. It was based on the TV show, but the way they were in the books, I seem to remember it being closer to my own experience as I read those books while I was at school. This is one of his own inventions, and it's set within a world that's close to here, I think. I've been trying to work it out from the map. For some reason, I think it's close to here. I must have read something about where he grew up or where he lived. It feels like South Manchester. Railway lines, arches under railway lines, old factories, derelict, terraces with 3 up, 2 downs, and the high street. It feels like somewhere like Levenshulme in the 70s. And it's about a kid who finds a genie in the present day. A kid who lives in a house that's overcrowded, that has a granddad who lives in the caravan at the bottom of the yard. Counsellors who are useless, who do nothing to help the community, are just bothered about their own self-importance. And very interesting stuff about race, about the black and the Asian communities. I don't know if this is in print now. This was with Fontana Lyons in the 70s and 80s, and I think it came back in the 90s. The language about race is a bit too accurate to the time in terms of the way the kids talk at school and some of the adults. It's a bit salty and strong, really. For nowadays, I'm sure they would do something to temper that. and it's intriguing to come up against it. But it's the way that people talked in that time, especially at school. Very interesting what he does, especially with the the genie himself being from Baghdad, and there's lots of talk of the Middle East, and accurate language in terms of the way he addresses people and his field of kind of cultural reference, if you like. Really interesting stuff where the genie rewrites the little boy's homework on the Crusades for him, telling the story of Richard the Lionheart from the Muslim point of view. So it's very right on in so many ways. It seeks to redress injustices and imbalances, but from a position of being frank about prejudice and imbalance. And it paints this picture of a kind of urban sprawl, an urban decay that is populated by people who, communities who are in tension with each other, but also how those tensions become resolved and friendships are made. There's a really sweet friendship that the little lad Alec has with his nemesis, Ginger Wallace, who's I think Afro-Caribbean, and his sister, and they come together to help the genie. It kind of rushes to a climax, and I don't feel as if we see enough of the genie doing his thing. It isn't a story in which dreams are fulfilled, and there's one of those kind of Roald Dahl extravagant sequences in which lots of crazy things happen. Crazy things don't really happen. At one point, an extra room is grown on their house, but then the caravan is knocked over, so he puts it back. At one point, he has a very extravagant feast in his bedroom with the genie, but that's about as far as it goes. It's not a kind of loopy and extravagant fantasy by any means. And at the end, when the genie's kind of holed up in this derelict old factory, it's kind of sad and ends on a kind of a note of bathos, really. And the genie has to go off to recover his strength, leaving the humans to get on with their own lives. I know there's 2 sequels that he did in the 80s and then the 90s, Genie on the Loose and The Last Genie. I think both long out of print. So at some point I'm going to have to go and find those. I'd really recommend Robert Leeson's writing, though. I think it's challenging, and it's a way of writing class-conscious children's fiction set in a kind of urban realism that brings in fantasy. Exactly my kind of genre. And it's unusual to see it because I think it was in the 90s you got this splitting off, and you'd be told by editors within children's fiction that there's either gritty realism, and that's about class, and that's about drugs and sexuality and all the problems, and here's fantasy, which is lovely and very middle class, very Harry Potter public school and dragons, and very conventional and old-fashioned, and the two don't meet, and any attempt to bring them together is unwelcome. And that was the kind of world of children's fiction that I worked in for a few years, and I was always cross with that bifurcation. And it's great to find people like Robert Leeson who make no bones about introducing surrealism, fantasy, fairy tale logic into the middle of a very committed political kind of fiction for children. When I say political, I mean conjuring the world as it is, where the characters live, in all of its complications. And yeah, there's no rose-tinted spectacles. And we all cheer at the end when the lazy fat counsellor is doused in the canal and brought out streaming gunk from this terrible disused canal, and learns a lesson. because he was about to shunt everybody out of what he called a kind of slum area to the outskirts of the city, while, get this, the council redeveloped the old buildings and had luxury apartments built in their place. Nothing has changed. It's got worse. In the last, how long is that? 75, almost 50 years. It's the same issues. It's still political. So that was interesting. A really slim and potent read. I love the conjuring of the Genie stuff, the Arabian Nights stuff, in the middle of smoky old Manchester or Leeds or wherever it is, whichever northern city he's writing about. I have a feeling it's this one though. And that's the perfect thing for me to dip into. And I was cross and annoyed with reading contemporary books, horror, The Devil House. When I felt that everything was grinding to a halt in what I was reading, it helps me to dip into my almost endless supply of kids' books and young adult books that I missed at the time and have collected and stored up, ready for just these moments. It's a good reminder of the kinds of books that I love. So, hooray for Robert Leeson. I believe he died within the last 10 years or so, which was a shame to see. And it makes me want to read some more, especially the Grange Hill books and the rest of this series. The next thing, especially with October coming up, I've put aside piles of spooky anthologies for adults and kids collections, and those that kind of crossed over between, like the Fontana books of horror, which weren't quite as dark, I don't think, as the Pan books of horror, and were kind of friendlier seeming somehow. I don't know why that is. The kind of books you would sneak off the shelf and read short stories from, almost surreptitiously, because all of these were pretty dark and macabre and disturbing. So I picked out for myself this first volume from the Fontana Books of Horror from 1966. Christine Bernard edited these first few. Later it passed to Mary Danby in the 70s, and she was a wonderful editor who got lots of contemporary writers doing contemporary set stories. In these earlier ones, you had people like L.P. Hartley, Algernon Blackwood, Robert Aikman, Hugh Walpole, alongside kind of new, as it were, people like Joan Aiken or Nigel Neal. You can see how editors balanced the expense. It was cheap to have a few out of copyright classics and then pay for new people to write new things, or get recent classics by people like Ray Bradbury, he's in here, with a story I don't know actually, or don't recognise. So they were kind of interesting mixtures early on between the old and the new, the Edwardian and the post-war and the contemporary, just like the Pan books were. And eventually Fontana would have its own kind of identity as a horror series, and much preferable, I think, to the Pan books, to me anyway. Not least for their very lurid covers, photographic covers, as the series went on. They're worth looking at. The one of there's a locust clutching a peg doll as if to eat it is classic. There's a giant parrot woman on the front of another. Anyway, the story I picked out, because what you do with these is just dip into them. You have them all over the place, all over the house, ready to dip into when you have reading time. That's what I love to do in the kind of spooky seasons leading up to Halloween, through the autumn into Christmas. I saw somebody online describe it as the Ber months, B-E-R, and of course they are. September, October, November, December. I think I've never heard that before. After all these years, never thought about, of course, they're the Ber months. Anyway, I read a story by Nigel Neal called The Pond, which I must have read before. It seems familiar in the way that lots of these stories do. You know what the kind of twists are going to be. You know what the shocks are going to be, almost instinctively. This is one about a man who is emptying a pond of all of its frogs one by one, and he thinks he's got the last one, and we begin with him capturing it. A brilliant description of putting some kind of net with a hoop over the frog, and it tries to escape, and he takes it home and kills it with a needle through its mouth, he says, so as not to spoil the skin. And of course he's taking the skin and he's melting off the flesh and taking the bones and hooking the bones all together, and he's going to stuff it using sheep's wool he's plucked from the fence. All these details are fantastic, and the whole story is very meticulous as he tells it. And then we get introduced to this diorama he's created in his house of frogs at a kind of Cinderella ball with lace hankies and fancy outfits dancing together, frozen forever, and looking very elegant. And this is the last frog, Prince Charming. But then, of course, as the old man works through the night, it's quiet, and he suddenly hears this massive croaking noise from outside, from the direction of the pond. I'm not going to give spoilers, but he hears this massive croak from a pond he thought was empty, and he goes to investigate. It's such a macabre, silly, and nasty story. Nigel Neal was the man who wrote Quatermass and lots of other TV classics over the years, and he had this career alongside those as a very anthologized writer of spooky short stories. So whenever his stories turn up in these books, as they do, it's worth seizing on them. I believe that somebody in recent years published or republished his collection of stories, which I hope would include all the spooky ones, and especially The Pond. I'll have to look that up and find out. So those have been the kind of highlights of my reading while I've been chucking things. I've read some of Storyland by Amy Jeffs, which I enjoyed, but the explications at the end of each chapter, telling you where she got this and this bit of legend from, can be a bit dry, I think. The folktale stuff itself, especially when it's told as a story, putting you right in the thick of it, is readable, sometimes very readable, but we get a bit of academic apparatus, very light actually in academic terms, but it jolts me out of the story. So it's something I would dip into, I think, rather than read from beginning to end. I think that's true, but I'm still enjoying it gradually. It'll stay on my ongoing reads shelf, as will this Natural History of Ghosts by Roger Clark, which seems like a good thing to be dipping into this time of year. This is the thing that I don't think I'm going back to, Devil House by John Darnielle. I feel bad because it's for book club, which is the week after next. We've delayed it by a week because of a gig that we're all going to, where a friend of ours is singing. So we've delayed book club, but I don't think I'll return to this. It felt a bit exposition heavy and sleazy. Telling the story from the point of view of an obsessive writer of non-fiction is interesting, but it means that we have to share his fascination and his strange way, and a fascination with his strange way of working so meticulously. We were hearing all this stuff, but I wasn't sure why we should care, and that's important, I think. Speaking of which, why we should care, the idea of why we should care in a thriller. Mary Higgins Clark. I haven't read one for a number of years, and last night I just picked one up at random, wanting to disappear inside a book that I would care about. She's a very, very commercial thriller writer, as you may know. I first read one about 18 years ago on a plane back from the States. I picked a book up at the airport, and it was her first. And it was when I was really into very commercial thrillers. And she turns a good tale, as they say. This is one about a woman wrongly convicted, we think, we hope. And that's the key, isn't it? She goes to prison for 5.5 years and comes out determined to prove that she didn't kill her husband. Everybody in the world assumes that she did, even the ex-girlfriend turned reporter who's going to help her and do a TV show about her. Even she thinks that she actually did the deed. And it's interesting that from the very start, we're on her side and hoping that she finds a way to exonerate herself. And it's interesting how she does that, because the characters are quite thin. They're magazine thin. Each character, and there's quite a lot of them, doctors and lawyers and journalists and housekeepers, arrive with, a very thumbnail sketch list of their kind of attributions and physical tics and how they look and who they are, and you get that very quickly. So it's pretty rudimentary in lots of ways, but it moves like a board game. You move through it as if you're playing a board game from chapter to chapter, advancing these characters on each other. And you're aware of some kind of dark secret at the heart of it in this glitzy hospital. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd never thought that before. The way that this very efficient kind of genre fiction, whichever genre it is, the way it works is very like a board game. If you had to draw a picture of it, it would be Snakes and Ladders or something like that. I shall think about that more, and I'll leave you there on that thought. What do you think, Socks? Right, I will say goodbye and see you again soon. I'm not sure if it'll be a 3-day gap or however long. I'm experimenting and leaving longer gaps between episodes, just so you don't think I'm completely obsessive. I am. Anyway, goodbye, and I'll see you again very soon.